So I know some of you are blocked by the paywall, and this column is really important to me, so I'm going to read it to you, and I'm also going to post and link the actual column if you can get through to see it. But in any event, here goes. Every year, during the last few days of June, I sit at my computer and wait impatiently for the most important Supreme Court decisions to be announced. Like a sixth grader on the final day of school, I'm at my desk looking at the clock and anticipating that end-of-year picnic filled with surprises that will either delight or disappoint. Last year, the picnic brought the Dobbs decision, which ended legalized abortion. So it seemed like anything else would be a letdown. Boy, was I wrong. As I write this, getting ready to go out and celebrate on the figurative playground, the Supreme Court just announced that giving someone an advantage because of their race was illegal, unconstitutional, and dead wrong. If you thought that this was already the law of the land because of the 13th Amendment and the abolition of Jim Crow and the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, you probably missed the last 50 or so years where discrimination was regularly practiced, only they called it affirmative action, and provided some eloquent but specious arguments about how we still needed to level a playing field that was gutted with injustice. Anytime you would suggest that we had moved to a place where affirmative action was no longer necessary, you were called a variety of things, none of which were very complimentary. Many of them included phrases like ignorant, racist, and bigot. Now, though, with the decision in Students for Fair Admission, they can also call you constitutionally correct. The court, in a 6-3 majority decision, ruled that using race as a consideration in college admissions is illegal. The beauty and purity of that statement is self-evident. No one should be given an advantage on account of something they cannot control. Conversely, no one should be punished for that same reason. The mere idea that race has been used as a corrector for decades is anathema to the ideals of the freedom riders and the civil rights workers who died in their service. Of course, not everyone agrees with that interpretation of the case. Moments after the decision was announced, these were the sort of headlines that screamed with searing messages across the internet. Supreme Court guts affirmative action, CNN. Supreme Court outlaws affirmative action, New York Post. Affirmative action ruling will lead to segregated higher ed, The Hill. Harvard students devastated after Supreme Court affirmative action ruling, NBC News. Justice Jackson rips Supreme Court's ostrich-like logic on affirmative action, The Hill. And my favorite of all, Clarence Thomas attacks Ketanji Brown Jackson over affirmative action, Newsweek. That last headline was attached to an article that reflected a philosophy that I have held for many years, and one that has finally gained some traction with a high court that now has a conservative majority courageous enough to finally tell the emperor that he has no clothes. Using the term affirmative action allowed people to believe that what was being done was not a negative form of discrimination, but rather a positive and affirmative attempt at restorative justice. In her dissent, Justice Jackson lamented the historical racism that left many students of color lagging behind, and referenced Frederick Douglass, Justice Harlan, and the, quote, pernicious inequities that have made it difficult for Black people to stand on their own 2 feet. Justice Thomas pointed out the flaws in Justice Jackson's backward-looking dissent, writing that, quote, as she sees things, we are all inexorably trapped in a fundamentally racist society with the original sin of slavery and the historical subjugation of Black Americans still determining our lives today, end quote. The tension between the two Black justices delineates in the clearest of terms the divide in this country between those who see race-based decisions as wrong regardless of who is being favored, and those who think that it is okay to continue decades on to favor most minorities, with the exception of Asian Americans, in order to continue to level a playing field that has given us a black president, vice president, senators, Oscar winners, astrophysicists, Nobel laureates, Olympians, teachers, and at last count, 3 Supreme Court justices. The fact that these things have happened gives the lie to the argument that we are still and forever a hopelessly racist society where the color of our skin must be used to measure the content of our character. This is not to say that racism has been conquered. It exists, it is blatant, and it will never fully disappear from the human psyche because we are imperfect creatures. What has been happening, though, is that society has continued to evolve to the point where we are no longer automatically to look at the color of someone's skin or the particular cadence of their accent to classify people. We no longer assess merit and virtue based on things we cannot control. And when we do, there are laws against that, including the most important law of all, the Constitution. But you know what the law cannot and should not do? It cannot use a form of discrimination against one group to advance a false narrative that another group is failing because of historical persecution. This is unfair, and this is something that the Supreme Court had the courage to finally recognize. And how fitting that they did so only days before we commemorate the flawed but fierce courage of our founders, who believed that, at least in an aspirational way, all men are created equal. Perhaps we are inching closer to believing that ourselves.